The Lightning in the Pasture. It was a March afternoon in 1987 when it all began. The sun still shone brightly over the fields of São Bento do Sapucaí in the interior of São Paulo, but those who knew the region could recognize the signs. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon like a gray wall, bringing with them the characteristic smell of approaching rain. Joseph Anthony Stone was 52 years old and knew those lands like the back of his hand. He had been born there, grown up running barefoot through the pastures, helping his father with the cattle since he was a boy. Now, 3 decades later, he was the one who managed the properties in the region, a man respected for his dedication and knowledge of cattle raising. On that particular afternoon, Joseph Anthony had gone out to check on a herd of cattle grazing on a more distant property. It was routine. Every rancher knows that cattle need constant care, and he was never one to slack off on those responsibilities. He mounted his old bicycle, that faded blue Monarch that had accompanied him for over 15 years, and pedaled along the dirt roads that cut through the rural landscape. The pasture was about 3 kilometers from the farm headquarters, in a gently rolling area where the grass grew lush and abundant. It was a large plot of land with few natural shelters, just a few scattered trees and an old feeding structure for the cattle, a galvanized zinc trough, the kind of ranchers use to put feed and mineral salt. When he arrived at the spot, around 4 in the afternoon, Joseph Anthony found the herd scattered across the field, some heads near the trough, others grazing further away. Everything seemed normal. The animals were calm, chewing grass with that characteristic placidity of cattle on quiet days. But the weather was changing rapidly. Joseph Anthony looked up at the sky and felt a shiver run down his spine. The clouds that had seemed distant before were now approaching with impressive speed. They were heavy clouds, laden clouds, the kind that promise a strong storm. The wind began to blow more intensely, swaying the grass and bringing gusts that made the man instinctively close his eyes. He knew he needed to get out of there. Open fields during storms were dangerous, especially in a mountainous region like that, where electrical discharges were common. But when he looked at the herd, he noticed that some animals were agitated. 2 heifers moved away from the main group and walked towards a nearby fence, where there was a small hole that Joseph Anthony knew well. It was there that the cattle sometimes escaped to the neighboring property. He couldn't just leave and let the animals scatter. It would be a serious problem. He got back on his bicycle and pedaled toward the heifers, managing to guide them back to the main herd. But the process took longer than he expected, and by the time he finished, the storm was practically upon him. The first drops began to fall thick and heavy. Within minutes, what was a drizzle turned into a torrential downpour. The sky darkened dramatically, as if someone had turned off the lights of the world. Lightning began to streak across the horizon, followed by thunder that echoed through the fields with a deafening force. Joseph Anthony was drenched. His clothes clung to his body. Water ran down his hair and face, making it difficult to see. The bicycle slipped on the ground that was rapidly turning into mud. He looked around, desperately searching for shelter. There wasn't much place to hide. The nearest trees were about 200 meters away, and he knew that seeking shelter under trees during an electrical storm was extremely dangerous. The farm headquarters was too far to reach by pedaling in that intense rain. That's when his eyes fixed on the zinc trough. The structure measured approximately 2 meters long by 1 meter wide and was about half a meter high. It wasn't exactly an ideal shelter, but it offered at least some protection from the rain. Joseph Anthony didn't hesitate. He dropped his bicycle beside it and huddled under the metal trough, trying to protect himself from the increasingly intense falling water. The noise was deafening. The rain beat on the zinc with tremendous force, creating a metallic, constant sound that echoed around him. Every drop that hit the metal reverberated like tiny drum beats, multiplied by thousands. Joseph Anthony huddled as much as he could, hugging his knees, trying to occupy the smallest possible space within that improvised shelter. The herd had scattered across the field. Some animals ran back and forth, clearly frightened by the thunder. Others huddled under the few available trees. Joseph Anthony watched them through the curtain of rain, worried, but knew that at that moment there wasn't much he could do but wait for the storm to pass. The lightning intensified. They were no longer just distant streaks on the horizon. Now they struck close, very close. Each electrical discharge illuminated the entire field for a few seconds, followed by thunder that made the ground tremble. The air became charged with a strange, almost palpable energy. Joseph Anthony felt the hairs on his arms stand on end, an electrical sensation running through his body. The smell of the air also changed. It had a metallic, almost sour odor. These were the signs that preceded a very close electrical discharge, but Joseph Anthony didn't know that. He had never studied atmospheric phenomena, never read about the signs that precede a lightning strike. He was just a simple country man trying to protect himself from a storm. The herd began to behave strangely. The animals near the trough quickly moved away, as if sensing imminent danger. They ran back and forth, mooing differently, sharper, more desperate. Some threw themselves to the ground, others tried to hide behind small elevations in the terrain. Joseph Anthony watched the animals' behavior with growing concern. He had known cattle for decades and had never seen that reaction. It was as if they knew something he didn't, as if an ancestral instinct warned them of an approaching mortal danger.
Then, for a brief moment, everything went silent. The rain continued to fall, but seemed to lessen in intensity. The wind stopped blowing. Even the thunder ceased temporarily. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, as if nature itself was holding its breath before something terrible happened. Joseph Anthony felt a shiver run through his entire body. Something was wrong, very wrong. The air around him seemed to vibrate with an invisible energy. His hair began to move on its own, as if attracted by a magnetic force. The skin on his arms tingled intensely and uncomfortably. He thought about running, but his muscles seemed paralyzed by fear and the strange sensation that dominated his body. It was as if every cell in his organism was being crossed by a very weak but constant electric current. And then it happened. A blinding flash illuminated the entire world around him. It wasn't like the other lightning strikes Joseph Anthony had seen during the storm. It was much more intense, much closer. For a fraction of a second, everything went white, completely white, as if the whole world had been swallowed by an impossible-to-describe light. The lightning struck the zinc trough with devastating force. The electrical discharge traveled through the entire metal structure instantly, and Joseph Anthony, who was in direct contact with the metal, received all that energy into his body. Approximately 300 million volts passed through his organism in less than a second. The sound was deafening. It wasn't just thunder. It was as if the world itself was being torn in half. The noise echoed through the fields with a force that made windows of distant houses tremble. Birds that were sheltered in nearby trees fell dead instantly, their small structures unable to withstand the sound wave. Joseph Anthony felt as if he had been hit by a gigantic hammer. His entire body contracted violently, all his muscles tensed at the same time, and he was thrown away from the trough with unimaginable force. He flew through the air for a few meters before hitting the muddy ground with an impact that broke 2 of his ribs. But the most impressive thing is that he didn't lose consciousness immediately. In the first few seconds after being hit, Joseph Anthony was still conscious but completely disoriented. His entire body tingled intensely and painfully. It was as if millions of needles were being driven into every inch of his skin simultaneously. His ears buzzed with a high-pitched, constant sound that seemed to come from inside his own head. He tried to get up, but his muscles didn't obey his brain's commands. His legs trembled uncontrollably. His arms moved in an uncoordinated way. His vision was completely distorted. He saw flashes of light even with his eyes closed, and when he opened them, everything seemed to be enveloped in a strange, colorful mist. The taste in his mouth was metallic, as if he had bitten a coin. His tongue was numb, and he had difficulty breathing. It was as if his lungs had forgotten how to function. Each breath required a conscious and painful effort. Gradually, consciousness began to slip away. Joseph Anthony felt as if he was being pulled into a dark tunnel. The sounds around him became muffled, distant. The rain that still fell on his face seemed to come from very far away. His eyelids became heavy, impossible to keep open. The last thing he remembered before passing out was the smell, a strange odor like burnt flesh mixed with melted metal. Only much later would he discover that this smell came from his own body. Joseph Anthony lay unconscious in the middle of the pasture for almost 2 hours. The storm continued for some time, but gradually lost intensity. The rain diminished until it became a fine drizzle, and the lightning moved away, only streaking the distant horizon again. The herd, which had scattered during the storm, slowly began to regroup, but kept their distance from where Joseph Anthony lay unconscious. He was found by his close friend, Sebastian Foster. Sebastian was Joseph Anthony's neighbor and knew his habits well. When he saw that the storm had passed and Joseph Anthony had not returned home, he decided to go look for him. He knew the places his friend usually visited to care for the cattle, so he drove his old pickup truck down the dirt road until he reached the pasture where it all happened. From a distance, he spotted the blue bicycle abandoned in the mud. This immediately worried him, because Joseph Anthony would never leave his bicycle lying in the field. He sped up the truck and approached the spot, searching for his friend with his eyes. That's when he saw the body lying near the zinc trough. Joseph Anthony was motionless, face down in the mud, his clothes soaked and torn. At first, Sebastian thought he was dead. He jumped out of the truck and ran to his friend, shouting his name, but there was no response. He knelt beside him and very carefully turned his body to check if he was still breathing. It was then that he saw Joseph Anthony's condition. His clothes were partially burned, with dark marks that formed strange patterns, as if miniature lightning bolts had been drawn on the fabric. His skin showed burns in several places, especially on his hands and feet, where the electric current had entered and exited his body. His hair was singed, with some strands completely burned. But he was breathing, weakly, irregularly, but breathing. Sebastian knew he shouldn't move an injured person, but he also knew that leaving Joseph Anthony there, in the middle of the field, meant certain death. There was no way to call an ambulance. They were too far from the city, and cell phones didn't exist back then. The only option was to take him to the nearest hospital, which was in Santo Bento da Sapucaí, almost an hour away. With great care, Sebastian carried Joseph Anthony to the truck. Joseph Anthony was completely inert, like a rag doll. His body seemed heavier than it should have been, as if the electricity had even altered his density. He settled him in the passenger seat, tied him with ropes so he wouldn't fall during the journey, and sped down the dirt road towards the city. Throughout the journey, Sebastian talked to Joseph Anthony, hoping he would wake up, that he would show some sign of consciousness. But nothing. His friend remained unconscious, just swaying with the bumps of the truck on the uneven road.
They arrived at Santa Clara Hospital in Santo Bento da Sapucaí around 8 in the evening. Sebastian practically stormed the emergency room, carrying Joseph Anthony in his arms, shouting for help. The medical team on duty was immediately alarmed by the patient's condition.
Dr. Charles Edward Miller, the doctor who attended to Joseph Anthony that night, had seen many emergency cases throughout his career, but he had never treated a lightning strike victim. In fact, medicine at the time had limited knowledge about the effects of electrical discharges on the human body. It was a field still little studied, with few documented cases. The first examination revealed the severity of the situation. Joseph Anthony had second- and third-degree burns on several parts of his body. His heart beat irregularly, with arrhythmias that worried the medical team. His blood pressure was extremely low, and his body temperature had dropped dangerously. But the most worrying were the neurological signs. Joseph Anthony did not respond to external stimuli. His reflexes were completely altered. His pupils reacted strangely to light, and there were signs that the nervous system had suffered significant damage. The medical team worked throughout the night to stabilize his condition. They administered saline to combat dehydration and low blood pressure, medications to regulate heart rhythm, and treated the burns with the resources available at the time. But the truth was, they were navigating uncharted waters. 1980s medicine simply did not have established protocols for treating lightning strike victims. Joseph Anthony remained in a coma for 5 days. During this period, his family took turns by his bedside. His wife, Mary Ann, did not leave the hospital. His 3 children, Robert, 22, Anna Marie, 19, and John Charles, just 15, spent hours talking to their unconscious father, hoping for some sign that he could hear them. Dr. Charles Edward regularly updated the family on Joseph Anthony's condition, but the news was rarely encouraging. His body was reacting unpredictably. At times, vital signs stabilized and gave hope for recovery. At others, it presented complications that made everyone fear the worst. On the 3rd day, Joseph Anthony developed pneumonia. His lungs, already weakened by the electric shock, could not function properly. The medical team had to connect him to artificial respiration machines. The family was informed that the next 24 hours would be critical. It was in the early morning of the 5th day that Joseph Anthony finally opened his eyes. Mary Ann was asleep in the chair beside the bed when she heard a low moan. She awoke immediately and saw her husband slowly moving his head, as if trying to orient himself. His eyes were open, but his gaze was vague, lost, as if he couldn't focus on anything specific. "Joseph! Joseph, can you hear me?" Mary Ann whispered, holding her husband's hand. He turned his head towards the voice, but his gaze remained distant. He tried to speak, but could only produce incomprehensible sounds. His tongue seemed not to obey his brain's commands, moving uncoordinatedly inside his mouth. Mary Ann immediately called the medical team. Dr. Charles Edward arrived quickly and began to perform tests to assess Joseph Anthony's neurological state. He asked him to squeeze his hand, blink his eyes, move his feet. The responses were slow and limited, but they existed. "He's conscious," the doctor told the family. "That's already a significant step forward, but we need to understand the extent of the neurological damage." The following days were filled with painful discoveries. Joseph Anthony had survived the lightning strike, but the sequelae were devastating. His speech ability was severely compromised. He could understand what people said, but had extreme difficulty expressing himself. Words came out jumbled, out of order, or simply didn't come out at all. His motor coordination had also been affected. Joseph Anthony could no longer walk normally. His movements were shaky, uncoordinated. He needed support to get out of bed, and even then his legs trembled so much that it was impossible to take more than a few steps. His memory showed significant gaps. He recognized his family, remembered important events from his life, but had difficulty forming new memories or recalling recent details. Sometimes he would repeatedly ask about things that had just been explained to him. But perhaps the most impactful sequelae was the alteration in his personality. Joseph Anthony had always been a calm, thoughtful man, known for his patience and good humor. After the accident, he became irritable, anxious, prone to outbursts of anger that came out of nowhere. Small frustrations like not being able to open a jar lid or having difficulty getting dressed made him furious in a way that frightened the family. During the nights, he had terrible nightmares. He would wake up screaming, talking about lightning and fire, constantly reliving the moment of the accident. Marianne spent entire nights trying to calm him, holding his hands as he trembled with fear and confusion. The doctors explained that all these changes were direct consequences of the brain injury caused by the electric discharge. The human brain functions through very delicate electric impulses, and the massive amount of electricity that passed through Joseph Anthony's body had caused irreversible damage to several brain areas. After 3 weeks in the hospital, Joseph Anthony was discharged, but he was far from cured. The family had to completely reorganize their lives to care for him. Robert, the eldest son, took over the responsibilities with the cattle and rural properties. Anna Marie left her studies to help her mother with daily care. John Charles, the youngest, moved to an aunt's house in the city to continue his studies. The Stone family home became a kind of improvised rehabilitation center. Marianne learned basic physiotherapy techniques to help her husband regain some of his movements. She created simple exercise routines, began preparing special meals to facilitate swallowing, and developed her own methods to help him communicate. Joseph Anthony made slow but steady progress. Over time, he managed to walk again, although always with difficulty and needing support. His speech partially improved. It was still difficult to understand, but the family learned to interpret his jumbled words. The rural community of São Bento de Sapucaí mobilized to help the family. Neighbors and friends took turns assisting with work on the property, bringing food, offering emotional support. Sebastian, the close friend who had found him, visited regularly and became a kind of older brother to Joseph Anthony's children. But there was something that intrigued everyone. Joseph Anthony had developed an extreme sensitivity to climate changes. Days before any storm approached, he would become extremely agitated. He would walk around the house non-stop, complaining of intense headaches, saying he felt electricity in the air. At first, the family thought it was paranoia related to the trauma, but over time, they realized he was never wrong. Whenever Joseph Anthony became agitated in this way, a storm would arrive within 24 to 48 hours.
Dr. Charles Edward, who continued to follow the case, was fascinated by this phenomenon. He explained that Joseph Anthony's nervous system had probably become hypersensitive to variations in atmospheric pressure and natural electrical fields. It was as if he had developed a kind of biological radar for storms. During storms, Joseph Anthony would panic. Even after being repeatedly told he was safe indoors, he couldn't control his fear. He would hide under the bed, cover his ears, and often needed to take calming medications to avoid severe anxiety attacks. Joseph Anthony's story spread throughout the region. People came from afar to meet the man who survived the lightning. Some sought him out as if he were a kind of weather oracle, wanting to know when the next rain would come. Others came out of morbid curiosity, hoping to see some physical mark of the lightning. Joseph Anthony hated this attention. He didn't want to be known as the Lightning Man. He just wanted to go back to his normal life, take care of his cattle, work his land. But that would never be possible again.
The physical sequelae persisted over the years. Joseph Anthony developed early arthritis, possibly related to the damage caused by electricity to his joints. His hands trembled constantly, making simple tasks like holding a glass or buttoning a shirt difficult. His coordination never fully returned to normal. But perhaps the most tragic aspect was the loss of his professional identity. Joseph Anthony had dedicated his entire life to rural work, knew every aspect of cattle raising, and was respected in the community for his expertise. After the accident, he could no longer perform these activities. He tried to help his son Robert, but his physical and cognitive limitations made it more of a hindrance than a help. The depression that followed was deep and lasting. Joseph Anthony would spend days without speaking, looking out the window, lost in thoughts he never shared with his family. Mary Ann knew her husband was grieving for the person he had been and would never be again. As the years passed, the family adapted to the new reality. Robert fully took over the rural business and became a respected rancher, following the teachings his father had passed on to him before the accident. Anne-Marie returned to her studies and became a nurse, partly inspired by the experience of caring for her father. John Charles became an electrical engineer, a choice that intrigued everyone, considering the family history. Joseph Anthony Stone lived 18 more years after the accident. He passed away in 2005 at the age of 70 from natural causes, a heart attack in his sleep. Dr. Charles Edward, who followed the case throughout this period, considered his longevity surprising, given the extent of the damage suffered. During the wake, hundreds of people attended to pay their condolences. Many were neighbors and friends of the family, but others were people who knew Joseph Anthony only by reputation. The story of the man who survived the lightning had become a local legend. Sebastian, already almost 80 years old, made a point of speaking during the ceremony. With a choked voice, he spoke of the friendship that united them, of the day he found Joseph Anthony unconscious in the pasture, of the courage and dignity with which he faced his limitations for almost 2 decades. Joseph Anthony was a strong man, Sebastian said, stronger than any lightning bolt. He may not have been the same person after that day, but he never stopped being an upright man, a dedicated father, a loyal friend. The lightning changed his body, but it didn't change his heart. Joseph Anthony's story became more than just a tale of survival. It became an example of how life can change drastically in a matter of seconds, how a family can adapt to the most difficult circumstances, and how a community can come together to support those in need. The zinc trough where it all happened remained in the pasture for many years after the accident. No rancher in the region wanted to use it. It had become a kind of unofficial monument to nature's destructive power. Over time, rust corroded it, and eventually it was removed and discarded. But the place where it stood is still known by local residents as the lightning spot. When there are storms in the region, people still remember Joseph Anthony's story, and many avoid passing through that specific pasture during thunderstorms. Dr. Charles Edward, who retired years later, still keeps Joseph Anthony's medical records. He considers the case one of the most interesting of his career, and occasionally uses it as an example in lectures on the effects of electrical discharges on the human body. Medicine has advanced significantly since the 1980s, and today the protocols for treating lightning victims are much more sophisticated. Robert Stone, who is now over 50, still manages the family's rural properties. He occasionally tells his father's story to visitors, always emphasizing not only the drama of the accident, but the strength and dignity Joseph Anthony showed during the years of recovery. Mary Ann, who passed away in 2018 at the age of 85, dedicated the last years of her life to documenting the family's story. She wrote in school notebooks everything she remembered about Joseph Anthony before and after the accident, creating a detailed record that is now preserved by her children. In these writings, Marianne revealed aspects of Joseph Anthony's recovery that the family rarely shared with strangers. She described the nights he would wake up crying, not from physical pain, but from the frustration of not being able to express himself adequately. She told of the moments when he tried to perform simple daily tasks and despaired at his limitations. But she also recorded the small triumphs. The day Joseph Anthony managed to tie his own shoes after months of trying. The first time he laughed at a joke 6 months after the accident. The moment he managed to say, "I love you" to her clearly almost a year after the tragedy. Anne-Marie, who became a nurse, specialized in neurological rehabilitation. Throughout her career, she helped dozens of patients with brain injuries, always carrying with her the lessons learned caring for her father. She often says that Joseph Anthony was her first and most important teacher about human resilience. John Charles, the electrical engineer, developed a professional fascination with atmospheric electrical phenomena. He worked for years on lightning protection systems, designing lightning rods and grounding systems for industries and homes. His colleagues know his father's story, and John Charles always emphasizes that his professional interest was born from the desire to protect other families from going through what his family went through.
Joseph Anthony's story also caught the attention of researchers. In the 1990s, a neurologist from the University of São Paulo, Dr. Fernando Agustos, sought out the family to study the long-term sequelae in lightning strike victims. Joseph Anthony agreed to participate in the studies, undergoing periodic examinations that helped medicine better understand the effects of electrical discharges on the nervous system. One of the most fascinating aspects discovered by Dr. Fernando was that Joseph Anthony had developed a particular form of traumatic memory. He could remember with impressive detail everything that happened in the minutes before he was struck by lightning: the color of the clouds, the behavior of the cattle, the feeling of the charged air. But he had difficulty forming new memories about everyday events. Dr. Fernando theorizes that the electrical trauma had crystallized certain memories, making them permanently accessible, while damaging the areas of the brain responsible for forming new memories. It was as if a part of Joseph Anthony was permanently stuck in that moment in the pasture, eternally reliving the moments that preceded his transformation. During sessions with Dr. Fernando, Joseph Anthony was able to describe details he had forgotten to mention to his family. He remembered the specific sound the wind made as it passed through the wet grass. He recalled exactly what it felt like for the rain to hit the zinc trough. He could describe the exact position of each animal in the herd at the moment of the discharge. These sessions were simultaneously therapeutic and painful for Joseph Anthony. On one hand, being able to articulate his memories helped him process the trauma. On the other hand, forcing him to mentally relive those moments always left him emotionally shaken for days. Dr. Fernando published several scientific articles based on Joseph Anthony's case, always preserving his identity. The studies contributed significantly to the medical understanding of the neurological sequelae of atmospheric discharges and are still cited today in specialized literature. A particularly interesting discovery was that Joseph Anthony had developed a form of traumatic synesthesia. He associated certain tactile sensations with specific colors and sounds. When he touched metallic objects, he saw flashes of white light. When he heard distant thunder, he felt a metallic taste in his mouth. It was as if a part of Joseph Anthony was permanently stuck in that moment in the pasture, eternally reliving the moments that preceded his transformation. During sessions with Dr. Fernando, Joseph Anthony was able to describe details he had forgotten to mention to his family. He remembered the specific sound the wind made as it passed through the wet grass. He recalled exactly what it felt like for the rain to hit the zinc trough. He could describe the exact position of each animal in the herd at the moment of the discharge.
These sessions were simultaneously therapeutic and painful for Joseph Anthony. On one hand, being able to articulate his memories helped him process the trauma. On the other hand, forcing him to mentally relive those moments always left him emotionally shaken for days. Dr. Fernando published several scientific articles based on Joseph Anthony's case, always preserving his identity. The studies contributed significantly to the medical understanding of the neurological sequelae of atmospheric discharges and are still cited today in specialized literature. A particularly interesting discovery was that Joseph Anthony had developed a form of traumatic synesthesia. He associated certain tactile sensations with specific colors and sounds. When he touched metallic objects, he saw flashes of white light. When he heard distant thunder, he felt a metallic taste in his mouth. It was as if a part of Joseph Anthony was permanently stuck in that moment in the pasture, eternally reliving the moments that preceded his transformation. During sessions with Dr. Fernando, Joseph Anthony was able to describe details he had forgotten to mention to his family. He remembered the specific sound the wind made as it passed through the wet grass. He recalled exactly what it felt like for the rain to hit the zinc trough. He could describe the exact position of each animal in the herd at the moment of the discharge. These sessions were simultaneously therapeutic and painful for Joseph Anthony. On one hand, being able to articulate his memories helped him process the trauma. On the other hand, forcing him to mentally relive those moments always left him emotionally shaken for days. Dr. Fernando published several scientific articles based on Joseph Anthony's case, always preserving his identity. The studies contributed significantly to the medical understanding of the neurological sequelae of atmospheric discharges and are still cited today in specialized literature. A particularly interesting discovery was that Joseph Anthony had developed a form of traumatic synesthesia. He associated certain tactile sensations with specific colors and sounds. When he touched metallic objects, he saw flashes of white light. When he heard distant thunder, he felt a metallic taste in his mouth. It was as if a part of Joseph Anthony was permanently stuck in that moment in the pasture, eternally reliving the moments that preceded his transformation. During sessions with Dr. Fernando, Joseph Anthony was able to describe details he had forgotten to mention to his family. He remembered the specific sound the wind made as it passed through the wet grass. He recalled exactly what it felt like for the rain to hit the zinc trough. He could describe the exact position of each animal in the herd at the moment of the discharge. These sessions were simultaneously therapeutic and painful for Joseph Anthony. On one hand, being able to articulate his memories helped him process the trauma. On the other hand, forcing him to mentally relive those moments always left him emotionally shaken for days. Dr. Fernando published several scientific articles based on Joseph Anthony's case, always preserving his identity. The studies contributed significantly to the medical understanding of the neurological sequelae of atmospheric discharges and are still cited today in specialized literature. A particularly interesting discovery was that Joseph Anthony had developed a form of traumatic synesthesia. He associated certain tactile sensations with specific colors and sounds. When he touched metallic objects, he saw flashes of white light. When he heard distant thunder, he felt a metallic taste in his mouth. It was as if a part of Joseph Anthony was permanently stuck in that moment in the pasture, eternally reliving the moments that preceded his transformation. During sessions with Dr. Fernando, Joseph Anthony was able to describe details he had forgotten to mention to his family. He remembered the specific sound the wind made as it passed through the wet grass. He recalled exactly what it felt like for the rain to hit the zinc trough. He could describe the exact position of each animal in the herd at the moment of the discharge. These sessions were simultaneously therapeutic and painful for Joseph Anthony. On one hand, being able to articulate his memories helped him process the trauma. On the other hand, forcing him to mentally relive those moments always left him emotionally shaken for days. Dr. Fernando published several scientific articles based on Joseph Anthony's case, always preserving his identity. The studies contributed significantly to the medical understanding of the neurological sequelae of atmospheric discharges and are still cited today in specialized literature. A particularly interesting discovery was that Joseph Anthony had developed a form of traumatic synesthesia. He associated certain tactile sensations with specific colors and sounds. When he touched metallic objects, he saw flashes of white light. When he heard distant thunder, he felt a metallic taste in his mouth. It was as if a part of Joseph Anthony was permanently stuck in that moment in the pasture, eternally reliving the moments that preceded his transformation. During sessions with Dr. Fernando, Joseph Anthony was able to describe details he had forgotten to mention to his family. He remembered the specific sound the wind made as it passed through the wet grass. He recalled exactly what it felt like for the rain to hit the zinc trough. He could describe the exact position of each animal in the herd at the moment of the discharge. These sessions were simultaneously therapeutic and painful for Joseph Anthony. On one hand, being able to articulate his memories helped him process the trauma. On the other hand, forcing him to mentally relive those moments always left him emotionally shaken for days. Dr. Fernando published several scientific articles based on Joseph Anthony's case, always preserving his identity. The studies contributed significantly to the medical understanding of the neurological sequelae of atmospheric discharges and are still cited today in specialized literature. A particularly interesting discovery was that Joseph Anthony had developed a form of traumatic synesthesia. He associated certain tactile sensations with specific colors and sounds. When he touched metallic objects, he saw flashes of white light. When he heard distant thunder, he felt a metallic taste in his mouth. It was as if a part of Joseph Anthony was permanently stuck in that moment in the pasture, eternally reliving the moments that preceded his transformation. During sessions with Dr. Fernando, Joseph Anthony was able to describe details he had forgotten to mention to his family. He remembered the specific sound the wind made as it passed through the wet grass. He recalled exactly what it felt like for the rain to hit the zinc trough. He could describe the exact position of each animal in the herd at the moment of the
The rural community of São Bento do Sapucaí also played an important role in Joseph Anthony's recovery. In small towns in the interior, where everyone knows each other, solidarity is more than courtesy. It is a necessity for survival. The Stone family never faced their difficulties alone. Neighbors brought food on days when Mary Ann was too busy caring for her husband. Others offered help with household repairs that Robert couldn't do alone. During planting and harvesting seasons, practically the entire community mobilized to help with work on the family's land. This support network allowed the family to maintain their dignity and independence, even when facing extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Joseph Anthony never felt like an object of charity. He knew he was receiving the same kind of help he himself had offered to others throughout his life. Time gradually brought a particular form of peace to Joseph Anthony. In his last years of life, his outbursts of anger became rarer. He developed an almost Zen-like patience with his own limitations. He would spend hours sitting on the porch, observing the movement of the clouds, identifying weather patterns with a precision that impressed even meteorologists. Robert discovered that his father had become a kind of climate oracle for the region. Ranchers would come to consult him before making decisions about planting, harvesting, or moving cattle. Joseph Anthony rarely erred in his predictions, based not on formal meteorological knowledge, but on bodily sensations he had learned to interpret over the years. This unique ability brought a new sense of purpose to Joseph Anthony's life. He could no longer work physically with cattle, but he could help other ranchers protect their herds from dangerous storms. It was a small but significant contribution that made him feel useful again. Dr. Charles Edward, who maintained contact with the family until the end, considered Joseph Anthony one of his most memorable patients. He taught me
the doctor would say that medicine doesn't just treat diseases, it treats entire people with their families, their communities, their dreams and fears. Joseph Anthony changed the way we practice medicine. When Joseph Anthony passed away in 2005, his death was peaceful. Mary Ann found him the next morning sleeping peacefully with a serene expression on his face. Dr. Charles Edward, who issued the death certificate, commented that he had rarely seen anyone depart with such peace. The funeral gathered hundreds of people. In addition to family and close friends, ranchers from all over the region attended, people who had been helped by his weather predictions, old neighbors who had followed his journey of recovery, and even researchers who had studied his case. Dr. Fernando made a point of attending, traveling from Sao Paulo to pay his condolences. During the wake, he spoke at length with the family about the contribution Joseph Anthony had made to medical science. He helped save lives, Dr. Fernando explained. The knowledge we gained by studying his case has been used to treat other lightning strike victims more effectively. Joseph Anthony Stone's story transcended the borders of São Bento do Sapucaí. His medical records, kept anonymously, were studied by researchers from various universities. They contributed to the development of new treatment protocols, prevention systems, and protection equipment against atmospheric discharges. But perhaps his most important legacy is the lesson on human resilience he left for everyone who knew him. Joseph Anthony proved that it is possible to find dignity, purpose, and even happiness, even in the most adverse circumstances. He showed that family love and community support can overcome any tragedy. Today, more than 15 years after his death, Joseph Anthony's story is still told in the region. Parents use his example to teach children about courage and perseverance. Healthcare professionals are inspired by his journey to treat patients with more compassion. Researchers continue to study his case to better understand the mysteries of the human brain. The pasture where it all happened now belongs to Robert, who keeps it as a kind of unofficial memorial to his father. During storms, he still avoids passing through there, not out of superstition, but out of respect for the memory of that day that forever changed his family's life. Joseph Anthony's blue bicycle was preserved by Mary Ann and is now kept at Anna Marie's house. Occasionally, the grandchildren ask about it, and Anna Marie tells her grandfather's story, always emphasizing not the tragedy, but the courage and love that defined the years that followed. Joseph Anthony Stone's story, the man who survived the lightning in the pasture, remains a testament to the power of nature, the fragility of human life, and the extraordinary capacity for adaptation and overcoming that resides in the human heart. It is a story about how one moment can change everything, but also about how love, patience, and determination can transform even the greatest tragedy into a lesson of life and hope. On stormy nights in the São Bento do Sapucaí region, when lightning cuts across the sky and thunder echoes through the fields, people still remember Joseph Anthony. His story serves as a reminder that we must respect the force of nature, value every moment we have with our families, and never underestimate the human capacity to find light even in the deepest darkness. But Joseph Anthony Stone's story has even more extraordinary aspects that only emerged years after his death, when researchers began to investigate similar phenomena in other parts of the world. In 2010, 5 years after Joseph Anthony's passing, Dr. Fernando received an intriguing call from a colleague at the University of Rio Grande do Sul. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a bioelectricity specialist, had read the published articles about the case and wanted to investigate if there were other lightning strike survivors with characteristics similar to those developed by Joseph Anthony. Dr. Thompson's research revealed something surprising. Worldwide, there were approximately 200 documented people who developed electromagnetic sensitivities after being struck by lightning. Some exhibited similar abilities to Joseph Anthony's: storm prediction, sensitivity to electric fields, traumatic synesthesia. It was as if there was a select group of human beings who had been modified by atmospheric electricity. Dr. Thompson decided to travel to São Bento do Sapucaí to interview the Stone family and gather more information about the specific manifestations Joseph Anthony had developed for decades. Robert and Anna Marie received the researcher with interest, eager to better understand the phenomena they had observed in their father for decades. During these interviews, details emerged that the family had never considered worth mentioning, but which fascinated Dr. Thompson. For example, Joseph Anthony could identify problems in electrical installations just by walking near them. Several times he warned neighbors about faulty wiring that later caused fires or electric shocks.
Anna Marie recalled a specific episode. Dad became very agitated when we visited Cousin Benedict's new house. He kept repeating that something was wrong with the light in the room. We thought it was his paranoia, but 3 weeks later, a short circuit in that room caused a fire. If Cousin Benedict hadn't left for work earlier that day, he could have died. Robert added another impressive case. Once, during a June festival in the city, Dad started to get nervous near the stage where the band was playing. He said he felt sparks in the air. He insisted so much that we called the responsible electrician, who discovered that the improvised installation was overloaded and about to cause an accident. They saved hundreds of lives. Dr. Thompson documented dozens of similar cases. Joseph Anthony had involuntarily become a kind of human detector of electrical problems. His sensitivity was not limited to meteorological phenomena. It extended to any anomaly in the electromagnetic field around him. But there was an even more mysterious aspect to his story, the apparent ability to influence electronic equipment. John Charles, the electrical engineer's son, revealed something he had never told his siblings. Dad could make digital clocks stop simply by holding them. I tested this several times with different clocks. He would hold them for a few minutes, and invariably the display would flicker and stop. When other people picked up the same clocks, they would start working normally again. Dr. Thompson asked to examine Joseph Anthony's personal belongings that were still preserved by the family. When Anna Marie brought the wristwatch he used, the researcher made an extraordinary discovery. The metal of the bracelet showed anomalous residual magnetization, as if it had been repeatedly exposed to intense magnetic fields. More sophisticated tests, later performed in the laboratory, confirmed that several metallic objects belonging to Joseph Anthony maintained unusual electromagnetic properties even years after his death. It was as if his body had become a constant source of low-intensity electrical fields, permanently altering the materials with which he had frequent contact. Dr. Thompson theorized that Joseph Anthony's nervous system had developed a unique way of processing and emitting electrical signals after the trauma of the lightning strike. It's as if the lightning reprogrammed his brain to operate at a different frequency, he explained to the family. He literally became a biological antenna. This theory explained not only his weather prediction abilities, but also the effects he had on electronic equipment. The human body normally produces very weak electrical fields, imperceptible to most devices. But Joseph Anthony seemed to generate significantly more intense signals, capable of interfering with sensitive circuits. Robert recalled another strange phenomenon. Dad couldn't use any type of pacemaker or electronic medical device. Doctors tried several times, especially in recent years when his heart began to fail, but any implanted device would stop working within a few days. Dr. Charles Edward, already retired but still interested in the case, confirmed this information when Dr. Thompson sought him out. It was extremely frustrating, the doctor admitted. Joseph Anthony could have greatly benefited from some modern medical devices, but his body simply rejected them. It wasn't immunological rejection, the devices literally stopped working. Dr. Thompson's research revealed that Joseph Anthony was not alone in this phenomenon. Other lightning strike survivors around the world showed similar incompatibility with implantable electronic devices. It was as if their bodies had become hostile to electronic technology. But perhaps the most impressive discovery emerged when Dr. Thompson managed to locate and interview other people who had developed electromagnetic sensitivities after being struck by lightning. He discovered that many of them reported extremely vivid dreams about storms, not only of their own accident, but of storms they had never personally witnessed. Marianne had mentioned this phenomenon in her notebooks, but the family always interpreted it as psychological trauma.
Joseph Anthony frequently described dreams about storms in places he had never visited. Tropical beaches, snowy mountains, arid deserts, always with extraordinarily precise details about the specific weather patterns of each region. Dr. Thompson developed a controversial theory. Perhaps individuals like Joseph Anthony had become sensitive to global electromagnetic fields, unconsciously connecting to atmospheric electrical activity anywhere on the planet. It was a hypothesis that challenged conventional scientific knowledge, but the reports were too consistent to be ignored. During his research, Dr. Thompson discovered historical records of similar phenomena. 19th century documents mention people who, after being struck by lightning, developed apparently supernatural abilities to predict the weather. Many were considered witches or sorcerers, persecuted by their communities for possessing impossible knowledge. One particularly interesting case was documented in France in 1847. Pierre Dubois, a farmer from the Provence region, survived an atmospheric discharge and later became famous for his accurate weather predictions. Like Joseph Anthony, he could anticipate storms days in advance, based solely on physical sensations. Pierre Dubois also reported dreams about storms in distant places and developed an almost mythical reputation among the local fishermen who consulted him before setting out to sea. Records from the time indicate that his predictions saved hundreds of lives over 4 decades. Dr. Thompson began to suspect that the ability to survive a lightning strike and develop these special sensitivities might be related to specific genetic factors. He decided to investigate Joseph Anthony's genealogy, looking for hereditary patterns that could explain his exceptional resistance to electricity. The genealogical research revealed fascinating information. Joseph Anthony's great-grandfather, Joachim Stone, had emigrated from Portugal to Brazil in the late 19th century. Records from his hometown parish mentioned that Joachim was known for his ability to feel storms in the air and frequently warned local residents about approaching heavy rains. Even more intriguing, 2 distant cousins of Joseph Anthony, living in different regions of Brazil, had also survived lightning strikes in previous decades. Although they hadn't developed sensitivities as pronounced as Joseph Anthony, both reported physical discomfort before storms and difficulties with electronic equipment. Dr. Thompson proposed to the Stone family that genetic tests be performed on Joseph Anthony's descendants to identify possible markers that could explain these characteristics. Robert, Anna Marie, and John Charles agreed to participate in the research, driven by scientific curiosity and the desire to honor their father's memory.
The results of the genetic tests were surprising. All of Joseph Anthony's children showed specific genetic variations related to neural electrical conductivity and electromagnetic sensitivity. Although they had not developed their father's extreme abilities, they possessed predispositions that could manifest under certain circumstances. Anna Marie, for example, had always been exceptionally sensitive to climate changes, developing headaches before storms. John Charles could identify problems in electronic equipment more easily than his engineer colleagues. Robert had a remarkable intuition for predicting weather patterns favorable to cattle. Dr. Thompson's research culminated in the publication of a revolutionary book, Human Antennas, Bioelectricity and Survival to Atmospheric Discharges. The book dedicated an entire chapter to Joseph Anthony Stone's case, presenting him as the most well-documented example of post-traumatic neurological adaptation to electromagnetic fields. Dr. Thompson's work gained international attention. Researchers from American, European, and Japanese universities began to investigate similar phenomena in their own countries. They discovered that what had happened to Joseph Anthony was not unique. It was part of a global pattern of human adaptation to extreme electrical traumas. In 2015, 10 years after Joseph Anthony's death, the Stone Project was established at the University of Sao Paulo, a research program dedicated to the study of lightning strike survivors and their neurological adaptations. The project is named after Joseph Anthony Stone in recognition of his involuntary contribution to the advancement of scientific knowledge. Robert was deeply moved when he learned of the honor. Dad always cared about being useful to people, he said, during the project's inauguration ceremony. Even after his death, he continues to help save lives through the science that his sufferings made possible.
The Stone Project has already identified more than 500 cases similar to Joseph Anthony's worldwide. It is developing specialized medical protocols to treat lightning strike survivors, more efficient prevention systems, and even exploring practical applications of electromagnetic sensitivities developed by these people. A particularly promising application involves the use of lightning strike survivors as biological sensors to predict atmospheric electrical activity in regions where conventional meteorological equipment is imprecise. Several countries have already implemented pilot programs integrating people with sensitivities similar to Joseph Anthony's into their climate alert systems. Joseph Anthony Stone's story completely transcended his rural origins in São Bento do Sapucaí. It became an international case study, inspired research in dozens of universities, and contributed to saving thousands of lives through better prevention and treatment systems for atmospheric electrical accidents. But for his family, he remained simply Joseph Anthony, the man who faced an unimaginable tragedy with dignity, transformed limitations into unique gifts, and demonstrated that the human spirit can find purpose and meaning even in the most extraordinary circumstances. Today, when visitors arrive in São Bento do Sapucaí interested in the story of the Lightning Man, Robert welcomes them to his farm and takes them to the place where it all happened. The pasture remains green, the cattle graze peacefully, and on stormy afternoons, when clouds gather on the horizon, it is almost possible to feel the presence of Joseph Anthony, the man who was touched by the sky and survived to teach us about the infinite strength of the human heart. And so it continues to echo through the years and beyond death, the extraordinary story of Joseph Anthony Stone, a simple man who became a bridge between science and history, between trauma and transcendence, between a moment of absolute terror and a lifetime dedicated to protecting others from the fury of the heavens.